Nothing had worked out the way he'd hoped. He should have expected it by now, maybe. After all, things never had before. And yet he kept on, pissing into the wind. He was like a man whose door's too low, but instead of working out how to duck, keeps on smacking his head into the lintel every day of his miserable life. He wanted to feel sorry for himself, but he knew he deserved no better. A man can't do the things he'd done and hope for happy endings.
Fiction is built on tropes, and no subgenre is more guilty of this than fantasy. The typical fantasy plot promises many things that the audience has seen about 1 billion times. Quests, prophecies, pitched large-scale combat against overwhelming odds, and so on. My question to you, dear viewer, is what if you take these tropes and whittle them down to their essence and subvert them? A world that still feels like fantasy, but keeps just enough realism and bad luck to kind of keep you on your toes. That world is the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Today I just want to talk about why this trilogy is, in my opinion, a modern-day fantasy masterpiece. And I mean, I'm not throwing that word around lightly. I think the First Law pulls off a pretty incredible balancing act, taking literally the best character work I've ever read, subverting expectations in a way that feels honest and intentional, and proving that maybe the ending that you want isn't necessarily the one that the story needs. In 2006, Joe Abercrombie released his first published novel, The Blade Itself, as book 1 of the First Law trilogy. Each subsequent year, he would release the next book in the trilogy, Before They're Hanged and Last Argument of Kings. The greatest tool in Joe Abercrombie's tool belt is his focus on character. And he knows it. He tells his stories character first, everything else second. Well, at first glance, you might see archetypes. Don't be fooled. These characters are messy, depressed, complicated, terrible, hilarious, and their motives are clear. But above all, these people just feel real. I mean, after all, you have to be realistic about these things. Out of the distant north comes a legend with a dark past. A barbarian killer known by many names. But all men fear the Bloody Nine. Now, within his aura, you see something else. Regret. Exhaustion. And while he's not a hero by any stretch, he does want to become a better man. During his time in this trilogy, Logen really wrestles with this idea, while also being faced with the reality of the world that he inhabits. You know, a world where if you're going to survive, you're going to have to do some terrible things. And Logan's past is just overflowing with terrible things. But this is not something that he's proud of. And this is what sets him apart from the culture of the North. He doesn't justify his violence with excuses. He just accepts it as the reality of his circumstances. But there is a part of him that he fears. The man that he becomes when there is no other choice. When men must die. This further complicates his desires, right? His wants. And it makes for an incredible story. And that's like the strength of a trilogy, right? You get to see this character as well as the other characters really struggle with things, really like grapple with their own nature. And by the end of a trilogy, you really start to understand these people like you would just anyone else that you know in reality. Sand Dan Glokta, at one point, was the type of hero that any fantasy story would benefit from. He was a handsome man, a master duelist. He was often cited as the best anyone had ever seen. But war changes people, never for the better. After being captured and tortured, he has left a shadow of the man that he once was. He now walks with a limp, what teeth remain are rotting and falling out. And he's overcome with these spasms from the pain that he endured, that are so bad that it can often render him just helpless. He now has the position of an inquisitor, an irony that the people of the Union are pretty quick to point out. The world that once threw open their arms for him now just sees him as a cripple and kind of a hypocrite. But his mind remains his greatest tool. Few men understand politics in the same way that Glokta does. He knows it's not purely strength that leads to lasting power. It's about control. It's about dirt that you have on somebody else, leverage, when to twist the knife, and all that. And while still being subservient to his masters, those who control him, he still understands that a man of his rank has to be like 5 steps ahead if he ever wants to start trying to climb that ladder, trying to play that game. He sees with almost like a fourth wall breaking clarity the hypocrisy around him, and he despises it. And he despises it while being fully aware of the fact that he is perpetuating the system that keeps these people in power. Much like Logen, he is honest about his situation. In some regards, he might even be the most honest character in this trilogy. I mean, like, what can he do? This man understands that the cycle will never end for society, so he might as well play the game. A game that he could win, but one he could never escape. The only escape is, of course, death. And they tried that once, didn't quite stick. So, should I keep that? Is that corny? That might be corny. Much like our friend Inquisitor Glokta, Jezal Dan Luthar is pretty much everything that we would typically want in a fantasy novel, right? He's handsome, he's young, he's got a really good position as an officer in the Union Army. He's got a bright future laid out tediously ahead of him that he didn't really have to try that hard to come across, Unfortunately, he is the most arrogant person you will ever meet, right? He believes that he deserves greatness because he's been told so his whole life. But as time goes on and as he grows and changes, he starts to realize that life is not necessarily as straightforward and as easy as he had been told it would be. He sees that the glory that he seeks may be an illusion, right? He sees that the Union doesn't necessarily care so much about what a leader does as much as how much they look like a leader, right? And by the end of his time in the trilogy, he has become living proof that sometimes the greatest lie is being told that you were ever special to begin with, and that the goal that you seek is not so amazing when you're nothing more than a man trapped by expectations. Let's talk about prose. Joe Abercrombie is a masterful author. His dialogue is sharp, witty, terrifying, and beautiful all at the same time. And while he does focus on characters more than anything, he certainly doesn't skimp when it comes to world building. Even though there's no official map that comes with the books or an official world name, it's a lot like an iceberg, You don't see a lot at first, but it's just the beginning of a wealth of world building. His combat is probably the best that I've ever read. He has mastered the ability to place you just squarely in the middle of chaos while also keeping a clear lens. You're never unaware of what's going on around you. Another thing that people don't really seem to bring up often when they talk about this trilogy is just how funny this series is. I don't typically laugh while I'm reading, but there are several moments where I chuckled out loud, just alone in my home while I was reading this. I'm not going to do that thing where it's there's like nothing less funny than somebody being like, here's a funny moment from a book I read. So I'll leave that for you guys to find when you decide to sit down and read it, if you haven't already, but I figured it was worth the mention. At a glance, you might see the first Law trilogy as just your typical grimdark, cynical fantasy trilogy. But under the microscope, we see something else entirely. Joe Abercrombie is not just writing like a fun fantasy story. He's writing a real one. Not real in the sense like, yeah, this happened last week, but real in the way that depicts human nature and the struggle with identity. I mean, it asks some pretty difficult questions, like the kind that you ruminate on while you're sitting in the dark alone. Does anything ever really change? Can we better ourselves, really? Do rulers shape history, or does society shape the ruler? Hard questions with harder answers. Some try and fail. Others don't and get everything that they wanted. Some survive, but at the cost of everything. And the world turns. The wheel spins. And that's what makes this a masterpiece, I think, is that it doesn't just focus on telling an incredible story, but it also holds a mirror up to our own humanity, to our own world. It shows us a world where there are no heroes, where the game is rigged, where power corrupts absolutely. It's a familiar world in an unexpected place. After all, you have to be realistic about these things. Thanks for watching.